Lady Leonora Harting's drawing room had been arranged with an artistry that was not accidental. One had the sense, on entering, of being persuaded into a composure one did not entirely feel. There were roses of the palest pink set in silver, a fire banked but steady, and the long curtains that broke the February dusk into softened panes of blue. The air carried a faint sweetness like pear drops, something medicinal perhaps, or merely the suggestion of it, and crystal chimed when the butler crossed the carpet. Sir Julian Cayley stood near the far wall like a soldier who has put down his sword and taken up his brush. The central canvas was shrouded, a length of cream silk floated before it like a dropped handkerchief. He kept his hands clasped behind him, as if that might discourage the impulse to fuss with the coverings. One or two of his old actors lounged near the hearth, talking in that undertone peculiar to first nights and private views, where the seriousness is a secret and the jokes are a veil. Lady Leonora, having made the sort of entrance her staff had learned to prepare for, a gentle emergence as if from mild weather, drifted toward her guests. Her pearls were ancient, her smile willing, and her eyes altogether contemporary. She saw everything and spoke of very little. "Sir Julian," she said, "if you twitch that rope once more, you will precipitate calamity. Even I, who enjoy a little calamity in moderation, should resent the timing." Sir Julian's mouth, he had what his friends called a painter's mouth, expressive and thin, made its brief apology. "My dear Leo, if painting did not turn a man into a tightrope walker, he would be a clerk. Forgive me. Habit." "They paint too," murmured Lady Leonora. "In ledgers, I believe." She turned. "General Crome, you look as if you have come prepared to take command of my hors d'oeuvres." General Bernard Crome, ruddy and rigid, took it in good part. "One likes to be certain of the ground," he said. "Your war boys is a marvel of reconnaissance. He brings back intelligence and small savories with equal finesse." War boys at that moment inclined himself, with a timing that would have gratified his mistress in a footman and did credit to him as a butler. He presented a tray of pale champagne. It was noticeable that Dr. Hubert Quine, who had just arrived, shook his head minutely and accepted instead from a second tray a small stained-glass tumbler containing something pallid and scenting the air. "My barley water," he said to Lady Leonora, with a smile so slight it hardly disturbed his features. "A vulgarity at a fine party, I grant you, but I can only prescribe what I am prepared to suffer." "That is what all priests say," Lady Leonora observed, not looking at him. "Dr. Quine, you find us in a most delicate state. We are concealing a portrait. You may approve." Dr. Quine's attention moved from her head to her hands and back again, not so much with admiration as with a doctor's habit of inventory. He was a pale man with hair so black it had a sheen to it, and if one expected a laryngologist to be vocally kind, one might be startled by the exactitude of his speech. There was humor in him, but it was all buttoned into its proper places. "I am afflicted with curiosity," he said, "only when faced with the pathological. Otherwise I reserve it. Curiosity inflames the throat." "Then heaven save us all on opening nights," said Anthony Dacre, who had drifted up without the courtesy of an introduction, which he felt he made superfluous by appearing. He was lean and handsome in the debatable way that gives an impression of angles drawn neatly in a ledger. His tie was perfectly slovenly. "Doctor, if curiosity inflames the throat, you should take the stalls at the Adelphi and watch my chorus. They are all on the point of martyrdom." Dr. Quine regarded him. "If they could be induced to keep quiet for 48 hours, he said, "you might have a chorus for 48 months, but Mr. Dacre prefers his entertainments immediate." "I prefer my entertainers to be allowed to speak," Dacre said, smiling past him and toward the corner near the piano. There, in a chair of sober grey, sat Fenella Brack, whom the brighter papers had decided was to be the voice of the season. She was a young woman with a complexion like a May morning and the stubborn, pointed chin that ruins or saves a beauty depending on the use to which it is put. A narrow black velvet ribbon lay at her throat. She was not, now, speaking. On her lap was a small case of cards like those left for tradesmen by retired ambassadors. When Lady Leonora bent to her, the girl raised one card on which had been written in a tidy hand, "Under medical orders of absolute rest. My apologies and my gratitude." The gesture with which she offered it, slight, quick, had somewhere learned to be brave. The ribbon at her throat quivered with her breathing. Dr. Quine, who had not needed to read the card, placed one hand, very lightly, on the back of her chair and removed it again as if he had remembered himself. "Exactly," he said into the air. "Miss Brack's cords are not ornaments. They require discipline, a fortnight of complete silence, and we shall see in what condition ambition leaves physiognomy." Celia Vavasour, who had been a contralto before contraltos were fashionable, had a talent for shade. She shaded her tone now. "And if ambition is a little bruised by discipline, Doctor, does that damage the voice?" "Character ripens everything," Dr. Quine said. "Even failures become tolerable if they are ripe." "Lord," said Anthony Dacre under his breath, "it's a greengrocer." Lady Leonora's fan, she allowed herself one affectation and chose a fan, stirred the air. "Fenella, you are not to be worried," she said gently. "We shall accept your silence with gratitude, and we shall compensate ourselves by looking. Sir Julian, when you are ready." Sir Julian, released at last, went with 2 long strides to the court. War boys moved unannounced to the French doors and quieted the curtains. The room steadied. The silk fell and the portrait arrived. There was a small, honest inhalation, such as people make when a near thing has not broken. The painting was of the girl. That was inevitable. Sir Julian had selected an attitude that was plainly suggested by the occasion and cunningly beyond it. She was shown seated and turned away, as if eavesdropping upon the viewer. One hand lay flat as a petal on the back of a chair, the other had lifted, without haste, to her mouth. A finger rested lightly there, not pressing, for gentleness is more tyrannical when it does not press. Her eyes, brought in from the turn and set slant by the artist's intuition, met the observer and forbore. "The quietus," Sir Julian said in a voice unusually humble for him. "It is presumptuous to name." She named it. Fenella looked at him and then down at her hands. Her throat moved. "It is indecent," Anthony Dacre murmured, not quite under his breath. "To exhibit deprivation for delight, like a starving saint, you will sell tickets." "That," said Sir Julian with courtesy, "is your art." "I see the doctor's hand in it," said Celia Vavasour, folding herself deeper into the chair beside Fenella. "I mean no insult to your unflinching truthfulness, Julian. The finger at the lips is not her finger." Dr. Quine did not smile. "No," he said, "it is mine." There was a pause that might have been made by the closing of a door in a distant corridor. Lady Leonora's fan consented to move. "Some of us," she said, "are not interested in ownership of feminine fingers. We have, after all, hors d'oeuvres. War boys." "Her ladyship's vol au vent," said war boys, and was complicated. The guests adjusted their attitudes to the picture as a room adjusts to twilight, without looking. It was noticed, and nobody alleged noticing, that Mrs. Ione Quine, who had come in with her husband and had taken a chair near the long table with its silver and glass and its single small arrangement of lily of the valley, did not look at the painting at all. Her hands were large for her slenderness. They were folded now, impeccably. She had a cool face, oddly timeless, and when she did speak, as she did to war boys asking for water, she did so with the reserve of a woman who has learned that other people listen to the wrong things. In the corner by the upright piano, Oliver Petherick, who wrote about pictures with a quiver in his pen, stood on the edges of his toes and made small notes. He had the luck to be thought honest, because nobody had ever been jealous of him. General Crome regarded him as one might a weather-vaned spire, with indulgence. Lady Leonora drifted again to Fenella, put her hand lightly on the girl's shoulder, and said, "You will allow me to be proud of your silence." Fenella squeezed her hand and raised another card. "Forgive the theatre. It is urgent, and it is kind." Anthony Dacre gave a short, irreverent laugh, and then the laugh changed into something else and died as he met Dr. Quine's eyes. There was an argument there, already exhausted and yet perfectly alive. Miss Martha Liddell, who was Dr. Quine's secretary and who looked as if she had been too well trained ever to say what she thought, approached quietly. She was small and neatly supplied with perceptions. Now she said to Mrs. Quine, "Madam, the carriage will return at 9 as instructed." Mrs. Quine's eyes moved, once to the portrait and then to the tray. She said, "Thank you, Martha," and nothing more. "I must own," Sir Julian said to Oliver Petherick, "that I almost abandoned that title." "Because it is a little funeral," Oliver suggested, without malice. "Because it is a little exact," Sir Julian admitted. "One tries to be generous with the thing, and then one recalls that accuracy is the only generosity left to us when our subject is young." "That is a cruelty disguised as pity," Celia murmured, and passed a savoury to Fenella with the gesture one learns in provincial lodgings that makes generosity look like innocence. Warboys, making his circuit with the assurance of a bishop in his cathedral, paused in a corner where Mrs. Emmett, the housekeeper, a woman of quiet miracles, had materialized long enough to receive instruction. He bent his head an inch, and she inclined hers an amount which suggested his inch had been precisely calculated. Their conversation did not take place. If it had, it would have been about a decanter of cognac which had been put in the wrong place on the sideboard, and which Warboys had removed with a glance. He disliked displacement. So did Mrs. Emmett. Between the two of them, the house maintained the grammar Lady Leonora required. All the same, Anthony Dacre said, who had not maintained anything as long as that house had, "All the same, we shall have to consider dates. I cannot hold the palace forever for a silent girl." Dr. Quine looked as if he would have liked to correct his diction. "If you prefer her whisper to her voice when she is 30, he said, "by all means." "Gentlemen," Lady Leonora said, "your quarrels may be submitted in writing. We are in the presence of a picture and of silence." Fenella raised another card. It said simply, "Thank you." The lilies of the valley gave up their faint cold perfume as if a thought had passed through them. One of the actors by the fire told a short, quiet story about a stagehand who had once stopped a play by being too efficient. Mrs. Quine asked Miss Liddell in that low voice of hers to obtain for her a glass of barley water. Miss Liddell, who had an orderliness that included the human heart as furniture, took the glass from Warboys and, in passing, made the smallest of tidying gestures toward the silver box that Dr. Quine had set on the side table near the portrait. It contained lozenges with a sheen to them like varnished chestnuts. She made no remark. When Lady Leonora, wishing to treat Sir Julian like a dangerous child in velvet, said, "You will not tell us where you have put the cruelty?" Sir Julian, with a sigh, said, "In the eyes, always in the eyes." "And the kindness?" asked Oliver Petherick. "In the hands," he said, and looked at Dr. Quine. He might have regretted it. It was not an evening of any great event. That was its quality. A door opened and closed to admit a latecomer whose lateness had been planned. A paper was subtly produced from the pocket of a man who had not been invited to read it and was carefully not read. A glass slid, unnoticed, to the edge of a table and stood there with a stubborn balance that embarrassed it. The fire burned down a fraction. The curtains, obedient to their weight, inclined toward each other. There was a serenity to them all which was born like a rule rather than a state. The discipline of it made the least turbulence noticeable. When Fenella, putting her card case aside for a moment, lifted her hand as if to test her own throat and then did not touch it, Lady Leonora saw and turned away. When Anthony Dacre's laughter refused to cue, Celia Vavasour warmed her hands and said nothing. When Dr. Quine looked for a fraction of an instant at his wife's folded hands, and then at the silver lozenges, and then at the portrait, Miss Liddell did not move at all, which was remarkable in her. At a discreet distance from the centre, Warboys attended like punctuation. He had seen more occasions begin, continue, and conclude than most marriages. He made a note, not mental but practical, as to the decanter of cognac again, and only then did he permit himself one thought, that the room had acquired the stillness that announces when the first speech has not yet begun, and yet the audience is tired. It was the sort of stillness, he privately felt, that makes people miss stares. Lady Leonora's fan closed on a breath. "We will dine in half an hour," she said. "Until then, moderate your cleverness. It spreads." There was the smallest scatter of laughter. They moved only a little. The portrait waited. The girl did not speak. The doctor drank his barley water, and the house, under Warboys and Mrs. Emmet and the persuasion of the curtains, held its breath. It was an evening of courtesy, therefore full of danger. They were polite, that is to say, they were prepared. The party died without drama, which seemed, in that house, a sort of courtesy. Rain pressed its fine lace upon the Cavendish Square windows. The lamps on the pavement outside drew long, patient ovals of light upon the wet. Lady Dacre, with her hand upon the balustrade, made her gentle dismissals. The General fumbled with his gloves and barked a small apology to no one in particular. Miss Davenant's laughter went down an octave, as if it were packing itself away. Julian Armitage stood, as he always stood at endings, with the abstracted air of a man who carries his own room inside him. Dr. Vale had put up his leather case with the neatness of habit and bade Adrian Fielding, almost tenderly, not to risk even a whisper. The baritone smiled, mouthed a "good night," and made a little mime of padlocking his lips. Simmons, the butler, moved the evening on with his skilled silence. He had extinguished 3 wall lights and half closed the door of the small library where the whiskey tray had been set for the men. It was a tidy room, book-lined, with a writing table and a low caned chair under the reading lamp. The faint smell of beeswax seemed to hold the smell of cigars at a distance, as if scent had its own rules of precedence at Lady Dacre's. There was nothing to mark the precise minute when Adrian slipped away. He had been by the hearth with Miss Davenant while she hunted for her gloves and found them in her muff. He had smiled with that appealing muteness which the doctor's injunctions had made into a sort of charm. Then he was no longer there. If anyone had noticed, they did not say so. It is a curious fact that people who have spent the evening watching one another under the guise of conversation will fail to observe a departure. Miss Lydia Mount remembered him when it was too late. She had gone back for the little ledger she kept for Lady Dacre. The accounts for the charity performance were a tangle and would not be subdued by the morning. The library's door breathed when she opened it. The lamp under its neat green shade made a circle of domestic intent upon the writing table. The caned chair held the weight of a man who seemed to be resting before a late walk home. Adrian's head lay slightly back against the chair's rim, his mouth parted like a singer's in the pause between the note and its echo. His hand, easy upon the chair arm, almost touched a small atomizer. The score on the table, Gluck, Lydia noticed absurdly, was open at a page marked by a penciled rest. She stood an instant, uncertain, with that instinct against intrusion that decent people are born with. Then the quiet disclosed itself. It was not the quiet one brings into a room, but a quiet that had been made there and was now complete. She set down the ledger, and the sound it made was out of scale. "Simmons," she said, but it was hardly a call. He came as he always came, at the correct distance from any alarm. He looked as he must look, first at her, then at the room, then at the man. He stepped around the chair as one steps around a sleeping child, and leaned. His face changed not at all, which was another of his useful accomplishments. He set the atomizer upon the table with a steadiness that was noticeable because the hand that did it was so assured. "Lady Dacre," he said. They did not touch the body. Miss Mount stood by the door with her hands folded as if at morning prayers. There was a faint, curious scent in the air, something like bruised almond or perhaps the ghost of a perfume caught in the leaves of a book. The rain tapped at the window and made a small, agreeable sound. Lady Dacre came as she might have come to inquire if a guest were comfortable. She bent, not too near. The civility in her face held. "He looks very peaceful," she said, and added at once, "We must be quick." "No doctor?" Miss Mount asked, and then flushed, for there had been a doctor not half an hour ago, and it seemed indelicate to say so. "A doctor," Lady Dacre answered, and in her voice lay one ironical octave, "will come in due course. Simmons, telephone, Scotland Yard. If Mr. Fox is available. If Inspector Alleyn—" She did not finish, but Simmons inclined his head as if at a menu choice and went away without noise. Julian Armitage had not gone. He had a way of being present when one presumed him absent. He stood in the doorway of the library and looked not at the body, but at the lamp. "How very beautifully lit," he murmured, which in him was a kind of distress. The general said "damnable" under his breath, and the oath had in it less vulgarity than prayer. Miss Davenant had put on her gloves. She made no sound that could be called a cry. She came forward until Lady Dacre's gentlest look checked her at a precise and considerate distance. "Adrian," she said, and the name lay on the air, a note he could not take. "We will all go into the other room," Lady Dacre said. "We shall be more useful there." It was the truth and a courtesy. They obeyed because one does. The library, which had always been a room, now had become also a scene. Simmons returned to say, without emphasis, that the yard had been informed. He added, for his mistress's ear, "At once, my lady." She nodded. She did not sit. When she spoke again, it was to no one in particular. "He had such a beautiful instrument," she said, meaning Adrian's voice. "And then, do not let anyone touch the tray." She moved her eyes toward the whiskey, which had been poured and barely tasted. In the library, the lamp continued to make its domestic circle of light. The atomizer stood upright now, an item in a gentleman's toilet. The penciled rest upon the open page kept its fastidious counsel. And somewhere, not far enough away to be another world, a motor car came to a stop, and a bell, quietly, discreetly, was pressed. Inspector Alleyn arrived with the quiet inevitability of good manners putting a room to rights. He came through the stage door as if he had been invited, nodded to the man in the little sentry box there, and crossed the corridor that smelt of camphor, wilted flowers, and that dusty sweetness which old velvet gives off under electric light. He paused only once to look at a red card on a hook that said silence, and, turning it over, read its reverse. Rehearsal. "Mr. Alleyn?" said the stage manager, in a voice trained to be at once carrying and discreet. He had the air of a man who could extinguish a scandal as one pinches out a candle. "Thank you, Mr. Treadgold." The man's eyelids lowered over precise eyes. "Lady Honoria is in the green room. She asked that you should be informed." Alleyn thanked him and went into the room where it had happened, observing first, as his habit was, the space rather than the people. It had the polished melancholy of a drawing-room lent to the theatre. Gilt mirrors above the mantel echoed with their own emptiness. A screen in chinoiserie veiled the corner where worn chairs made a little conversation. Pit and bowls of lilies, too many of them, breathed a pallid fragrance. The electric fire glowed in a grate purely for the look of things. Someone had turned it up too far. On the chaise by the fire, the doctor sat, the most punctual of men for whom time had quietly stopped. He had folded his hands together, loosely, as if he meant to separate them in another moment to make the small, neat gesture he made when pronouncing some ruling of his cult. The glass at his elbow had rolled, and there on the little table a white ring marked where it had once stood true. A spray, the new sort that made a mist and not a drop, lay just under the table's edge. A slender case in black kid, doctor's bag disguised as evening accessory, gaped its teeth. Treadgold's mouth made its professional shape. "We did not move him, sir." "No," said Alleyn. His voice was very quiet. He looked at the doctor's face, which had that curious, orderly look that comes with certain stoppages. The eyes, which had been active and rather shining in life, the eyes of a man who liked to be listened to, were settled. He thought, "We must, for the sake of the living, be particular with the dead." Lady Honoria stood near the chinoiserie screen, extremely upright, extremely controlled, as if she were at her club and had broken a rule by coming into the wrong room and meant to show that it was the room that was at fault. The actress, Alleyn, had noted her already, a handsome woman, the bones well placed and the voice placed better, sat on the corner of the screen as if it were a garden bench and looked at nothing. The young girl who had sung earlier, and sung with an earnest purity that would, under discipline, harden into something like art, stood too near to the chaise and stared at the doctor's hand, as if she expected it to move. Between them hovered a man with the soft shirts of a cultivated director and the face of a mild Roman emperor. There were others, and in the doorway the stage doorkeeper looked in and looked away again. "Inspector," said Lady Honoria, not so much greeting as acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," Alleyn said, "for the intrusion and the occasion." Silences in such rooms have their own layers. He let one of them rest and then began to wander. He went first to the mantel, where someone had placed a program in a porcelain trough meant for cards. He lifted it. It was scored in pencil in a small, exact hand against certain numbers, and against one, nocturne, a line with 2 dashes. Against another, interval, a circle. He thought of the red card on the hook. He put the program back. He considered the fire. The heat had a petulant feel to it. The switch was at its highest. He looked at the plug. It had been tugged, one prong showing the barest smear of something like powder. Orris, perhaps. The dressing rooms were full of it. He touched nothing. He looked at the lilies. The nearest bowl had a petal fallen on the table. It made a pale boat of itself by the glass ring. A faint drop had bled from the cut stalk onto the cloth. Under the table, a shard of something brittle had caught and held the light, and then let it go. He noted it and moved on. The spray he looked at long enough to be unremarkable. New, he thought, and fashionable. A small label in italic boasted of strength without harshness. The nozzle was wet. He had made a circuit and come back to the chaise when the door behind him opened. Carefully, and the man with the soft shirts murmured, "Inspector, if you wish—" "In a moment," Alleyn said. "We shall have to ask you all to remain within reach for a little while. Mr. Treadgold, perhaps you would be good enough to see to that." Treadgold inclined his head. It was the sort of thing he might have done in the ordinary course. The doorkeeper moved away before he was told. "Do forgive me," Alleyn said to the room at large. "I dislike fuss as much as any of you. Mr. Treadgold will have fresh coffee sent in. No one is to be dramatic. Mr. Ferrant," said the cultivated Roman. "Ferrant, would you be kind and sit down? Miss Lake—" He had remembered the name, a name that had been said in the way people say such names, lightly and with a weighted tail. "Lady Honoria and Miss—" "Arden?" said the girl without looking up. "Miss Arden." He arranged them without seeming to, as if he were redesigning the room. He saw at once who looked at whom, and who avoided the other's glance, and who held herself from the chair as from a faintly distasteful intimacy. He saw the door between the green room and the corridor was not fully shut, and, beyond, a figure in black moved with that economical precision that belongs to the old-fashioned dresser. The figure paused, and then went on, without a rustle. "You will want to ask us," Lady Honoria began. "I shall want to ask you very little just now," Alleyn said, and his voice, still courteous, let them know that he would ask a great deal later. "I shall, if you permit, look a little more." He looked at the doctor's left sleeve. A minute line of chalk showed against the dark cloth at the inner wrist, the sort that the stage leaves on anyone who leans against its flats. He looked, too, at the doctor's right cuff, turned back a thought too far, and at the small, clever hands, now patient. He saw the faintest indent on the chair's arm, where a ring might have pressed, and no ring now to account for it. He stood by the chaise, smelled the faint, clean bite of menthol and the sweeter, more common odor of spirits of wine. He straightened and, for the first time, let his gaze meet theirs as a whole. "We will have our little talks in a moment," he said. "Mr. Treadgold, that coffee." The stage manager moved. Outside, as if the theatre, affronted yet habituated, reconciled itself to the new play to be put on, the card on the hook stirred in a draught and showed, for a second, its other word. Then it was still again. Alleyn set the little drawing-room as his ante-room and asked Lady Honoria to begin. She came with a shawl caught at the elbows and that air of defiant fragility which society women adopt when illness is fashionable. She took the edge of a chair as if it might refuse her, and watched him with eyes that were frank without candor. "My dear Inspector," she said, "it's perfectly ghastly. I suppose you must go through your dreary catechism, only, if it could be done with the least possible fuss." "We shall endeavour," said Alleyn. "Your servants may have told you I shall wish to see everyone who was present." "Of course." She tried a smile. "It would be useless to pretend we are not all trying to remember where we were precisely when, wouldn't it?" "It sometimes simplifies matters if one doesn't try too hard," said Alleyn. "The small, unconsidered things come best that way." "You were in the music room?" "Until the dispersal." "Yes. After that I went upstairs to fetch a wrap. I'm subject to curious draughts in that house. One has always a gale under the doors." "The small room, the one off the morning room, who uses it as a matter of course?" "I do. For headaches and callers one can't manage," she said with dry humor. Verity telephoned in there sometimes. She disliked being overheard. The door is absurdly heavy. The bell push rings in the pantry. Mr. Swithin is ferociously prompt. Her eyes flicked towards the open doorway. "Inspector, I must tell you frankly, I could not have endured that poor girl to come to grief under my roof. I hope you won't make a public performance of it." "We shall try your patience as little as possible." He rose and bowed her out gently. Her fragility seemed to ease at the door. In profile, she was brisk, almost managerial. Dr. Peregrine Vale followed, punctual as a summons. His face was of those fine bones and pale surfaces that appear carved rather than grown. He placed his black case on the table, but his hand remained on it. "I'm told you advised Miss Dane to rest her voice," Alleyn said when they had disposed of preliminaries. "I did. I prescribed speech for 48 hours. She could never abide silence. She thought it theatrical to whisper." His mouth worked at the shadow of a smile that did not arrive. She was an impatient patient. A brilliant creature, if you like brilliance, with your raw meat. "Did you supply her with any preparation this evening?" "A soothing mist, an ordinary mixture. No sedatives. I compounded it earlier in the day and gave it to her at the surgery. If she brought it here, it was not at my insistence. She was to use it sparingly." "Were you alone with her in the small room tonight?" "I was not." The answer came neatly wrapped. He watched Alleyn, attentive, like a teacher waiting for an inconvenient boy. "You are certain?" "If you ask me whether I stepped in, when first we arrived, I looked at the place. I dislike such padded absurdities. They are an insult to the throat." He glanced, almost with distaste, at the black case. "I saw Miss Dane only in your hostess's drawing-room." Alleyn let the silence grow to its proper shape. "You knew everyone present?" "In the floating sense in which one knows anyone featured in the illustrated weeklies." The painter stared at her throat like a vulture at a jewel. The impresario counted her pulses in banknotes. The critic mistook himself for St. George. And the child, what is her name, was a shadow. Miss Tamsin Grey. That one. A shadow in sunlight. Dangerous at that age, with that sort of devotion. He snapped the case shut and rose. "If you require me." "Not yet," Alleyn said, and saw the faint affront behind the courteous tilt of the head. Basil Nyman, the painter, came in with a smell of turpentine that had nothing to do with the room. Paint had found its way to his cuff. There was a smear the color of sea glass along his thumb. He sat and crossed his long knees. His gaze slid to the mantel, to the roses, to Alleyn, and away again. "You knew Miss Dane well?" Alleyn asked. "If you can call it that. I understood her face. It changes for the public. For a painter, it stays still. She permitted me to see the face that does not perform. That's intimacy of a sort." "You were with her after the music?" "No. That is, no." She looked over the portrait. She was unusually silent. He let the word sit between them as if he challenged its propriety. Sir Julian was haggling over dates. Lady Honoria had grievances about lighting. The critic did his moth act round the flame. I went for a cigarette. There was, I think, a small commotion with a lost glove. "Paint on the telephone handle," said Alleyn mildly, and watched the impact. Basil's lips quirked. "Ah, then whoever lifted the receiver had been friendly with my palette. We were in the studio before dinner. I paint where I can, Inspector. Actors are rarely on time." "Did you speak with Miss Dane in the little room?" "No," he said too quickly, and added, "I dislike interiors that have no sound. One can't hear oneself think if that paradox pleases you." "It does not greatly please me," said Alleyn, almost smiling. "The critic, Mr. Dacre, was attentive." "The critic," Basil said, "is an understudy to fate. He throws his little knives and believes they strike hearts. Sometimes they chip a cup. He was to write something perfectly toxic and then amend it under pressure into something buttery. You know the style." Sir Julian Kestrel, when he came, had the air of a man who lives by engagements. His watch lay on the table between them as if to remind both parties of its omniscience. "You will ask me," he said, "if Miss Dane's contract was in danger. It was not. She was tiresome, erratic, divine, and expensive. That is the definition of a star. Dr. Vale and I had words about prescriptions that eat up rehearsals." "You resented his authority?" "I resent anyone who interposes a white coat between me and an opening night," Sir Julian replied, pleasant as a maitre d'. "I did not kill her to solve a scheduling difficulty, Inspector." "No," said Alleyn. "That would be an extravagant solution." Roland Dacre drifted in last, with a faint scent of violets and print. He adopted a tone for policemen that had probably done good service for waiters. "I adored her," he said, "professionally. The profession of adoration pays poorly." "You saw her after the music?" "I saw her before it, during it, and after it, in the sense that she occupied the front of one's mind," he said, and allowed the faintest, nastiest smile to pass and be forgotten. "She moved to the telephone. She had that habit. It was a way of not answering. I do it myself sometimes in restaurants." "Did you speak with her in the small room?" "I'm not admitted to boudoir, soundproof or otherwise," he said. "She kept me at a civilized distance. It was one of her many excellences. There was, how shall I put it, a murmur." He lifted a hand. Forgive the word. Between the doctor and our hostess. "What is the correct term? Lady Honoria owns the house, Sir Julian the occasion." "You are a friend of Mr. Nyman?" "I admire his canvases," Dacre said blandly. "I admire Miss Grey's ingenuousness. I admire Lady Honoria's management. I admired Miss Dane. It is exhausting admiration." Miss Tamsin Grey, when she came, looked as if a white hand had pressed her features flat and then released them. She sat with her fingers maize pale against a dark skirt and managed a nod that was not quite trust. "You stayed near Miss Dane much of the evening," said Alleyn. "I was told to." Her voice made a small sound that might have been bravery. "I fetched things. She asked me to bring the atomizer. I didn't like it. It smells of elder blossom, I think. I may be wrong." "Did you see her go into the small room?" "Yes," whispered Tamsin. "But I was not to follow. She said so. She lifted her hand. "And who came out?" She looked away. "No one," she said after too long. "I mean, I went to ask Mr. Swithin for a glass of water. The kitchens are far. When I returned, the door was shut." "And you heard nothing?" "No." Her eyes met his for an instant. "It is not that kind of room?" Alleyn let her go and sat alone for a moment. The house ticked and breathed around him, a creature that had learned discretion. Somewhere a bell rang and was silenced at once. He thought of the doctor's precise contempt, of the painter's swift denial, of Sir Julian's economy, of the critic's little knives, and of the child who may or may not have lied. He rang for Mr. Swithin and asked for the servants, and when the butler came, already composed into correctness, Alleyn saw, beneath the impassivity, the effort of a man keeping ritual from breaking. The back regions of grey stones were as self-contained as a cloister, and nearly as silent. After luncheon, when the house had resumed its suspended composure, Alleyn followed the narrow passage beyond the baize door and paused, with that air of absent-minded gentility which was one of his better weapons, at the threshold of the pantry. Mr. Fallow, spare and immaculate, was polishing the crest on a salver in small rhythmical movements. He inclined his head without surprise. Servants in well-drilled houses accepted policemen as they accepted draughts of air, necessary, not to be argued with, and to be kept out of the drawing-room. "If it would not trouble you," Alleyn said, "I should like to see the arrangements for last night. Trays, coffee things, a domestic archaeology." "Very good, sir," said Mr. Fallow. He put down the salver and opened a cupboard. "The coffee tray, sir. Cleaned directly after. We do for two always for the library of an evening. Her ladyship likes her tisane, prepared separately in the still room under Mrs. Stokes, while the gentleman guest is offered coffee and such like. The port decanter, this one, goes as a matter of routine. Sir Peregrine preferred brandy. We have a small for that." Alleyn considered the tray, 2 cups, one plain white, another with a sprigged border. He lifted them delicately. The plain one held the ghost of lemon balm and something more bitter. The sprigged showed a darker ring where coffee had cooled. "You reassemble your practice after each performance," he said, almost to himself. "I envy you." "Custom, sir," said Mr. Fallow. "The library bell, Mr. Fallow." Alleyn touched the indicator board on the wall, a polite forest of names and lights. "I think it did not ring." "No, sir." "It is out of order." There was the smallest of hesitations, of the sort that registered in Alleyn like a draft across shutters. Mrs. Stokes mentioned some irregularity. "We have had gentlemen from Lewis for the wiring. It is in hand." "Ah," said Alleyn. He smiled. "Do you now and then long for silence in your bells, Mr. Fallow?" "Silence, sir," said Mr. Fallow with no inflection, "is often ordered at Greystones." Alleyn let it pass like a fish under a bridge. He asked, still in the tone of one prolonging a civil chat, "You took in the tray at what hour?" 10:30, sir." "2 cups?" "2. Her ladyship's tisane is not taken in there by routine." "So you took in the coffee only?" "The coffee, sir, and brandy if required." "And was it?" "Yes, sir." "By whom?" "Sir Peregrine." "And you saw him drink it?" "I set it by his chair." "Quite so." Alleyn's fingers, pale and precise, closed briefly over the handle of the sprigged cup. "And you removed it when?" "When the room was cleared. After the discovery." Alleyn nodded. There was nothing to be gained from the brutal noun. "Mrs. Stokes?" She approached from the still room, a substantial woman whose cap had an air of invincibility. The odor that preceded her was of boiled sugar and herbs and order. She looked at Alleyn with a composed, faintly maternal eye. "You'll be wanting the list, sir," she said, producing from her apron a penciled paper. "Of what went up and what came down. It's my habit." He took the list. In a neat hand. Coffee, 2, brandy, small. Biscuits, unsalted. Tisane, lemon balm with orange flower. Warmed milk, 1. "Warmed milk?" he asked. "For Dr. Ashe, sir. He asked for it. Not taken in the library, in the morning room. He wrote a prescription there, I think, and said milk was to his purpose." Alleyn looked up and found both servants had let their faces slip into a blankness that was not dullness but vigilance. "It is a good house," he said. "Is it that you don't like to see it undone by talk?" Mrs. Stokes, after a moment, answered very quietly. "It is that people say more than they mean, sir, and can't unsay it." "Quite. Will you tell me all the same if anything last night was done out of its habit?" She considered, and Mr. Fallow's eyes moved to the board. "The library is always aired for the evening," she said. "Yesterday the fire was lighted earlier. That is not unusual in damp weather. The brandy bottle is replenished on Fridays. Yesterday Mr. Fallow noticed the level down and topped it." Mr. Fallow cleared his throat. "If I might qualify, Mrs. Stokes, I topped it as per custom. The level was as it stood." "Thank you," Alleyn said. "And the tisane?" "Her ladyship took it in her room later than as usual," Mrs. Stokes said. "That was on Dr. Ashe's direction. Quiet to be kept." "In the house?" "In her ladyship's vicinity, sir." "Silence prescribed," murmured Alleyn. He looked at the list again, at the small domestic poetry of it, and then at Mrs. Stokes. "Miss Lorne is at her table, I suppose." "In the little study, sir, copying a letter." Miss Lorne was the exception that proved the household's rule, a quiet woman in an unquiet office. At her desk, with an old Remington purring and erasing, she rose as Alleyn came in and made a slight, apologetic inclination of the head. She wore the intractable clothes of secretaries who are also poor relations, and had a pale, staid prettiness that, in certain lights, could be mistaken for severity. "You were with Dame Callista for most of the evening?" Alleyn asked, and when she had said yes, added with a courtesy that disarmed, "I won't detain you past reason." "It is no trouble," said Miss Lorne. She kept her hands on the edge of the desk as though they might betray her. "I was asked by Dr. Ashe to impress upon Lady Callista the necessity of rest. He did not wish for any excitement." "Excitement," said Alleyn, "is a promiscuous fellow. He finds his way into quiet houses." "Not if one locks the door," said Miss Lorne, and seemed to be surprised by her own sentence. She colored. "You typed a letter," he said gently. "To whom?" "To Mr. Stroud," she said after a pause. "The producer. It was dictated before dinner. Lady Callista wished to alter a clause. Dr. Ashe advised her not to speak. I took it down from her notes and Mr. Stroud's previous copy." She looked down at the ribbon-stained paper as if it were an affidavit. "You know more than you say, Miss Lorne," Alleyn said, still very gently. "It is not that you wish to be unjust. It is that you are loyal." Her eyes lifted, clear and unexpectedly brave. "I am loyal to what is true, Inspector. If that's silence for the moment, then I suppose it is prescribed." He bowed his head to the little barb in her sentence and left her to her typewriter, the quiet chattering of which followed him into the corridor. On the staircase he met Biddy, the maid, a slip of a girl with a scratched hand and an air of guilty industry. She bobbed and would have scurried past, but Alleyn's voice, tender as one might address a skittish horse, detained her. "You were the one to draw the curtains in the library last night." "Yes, sir. Only I didn't, sir. It was done. The door was shut." "Shut? Yes, sir. It's always left on the latch for the gentleman. Mr. Fallow makes it so." She bit her lip. "I'm not to say it." "Who told you you were not to say it?" She looked at her hands. "No one, sir." Only, well, Mrs. Stokes says to mind my work and not to carry tales." "You have minded it very well," said Alleyn. He let her go and stood a moment by the grey curve of the stair. The house held its breath. Out of it came the small domestic sounds. Water, a far-off click of a latch, the Remingtons' attenuated clatter, and something else. The felt pressure of secrets that were not a plot so much as a politeness grown dangerous. He went back to the library and, out of politeness, closed the door behind him. The bell-pull hung decorously by the hearth. He tugged it. The indicator did not stir. In the silence that followed, prescribed and accepted, Alleyn stood looking down at the sprigged cup on the tray and at the fire, which had been very well laid earlier in the day. The rain, which had restrained itself to a careful murmuring during the night, now made a more positive case on the panes of Lady Honoria's service corridor. In the pantry, the air held that scented cleanness peculiar to the well-managed house, a polish of beeswax, cold silver, and damp linen. Pritchard stood under the row of demi-tasse cups as though beneath a stiff garland. His hands, which had remained so impeccably still in drawing-rooms, were here allowed a certain eloquence. They hovered, demonstrated, corrected the ghost of some error. Alleyn had asked, in his mildest way, for the ritual of coffee. Fox, having subsided as comfortably as a man of his proportions could into a pantry chair, became an unobtrusive piece of heavy furniture. "We are old-fashioned, sir," said Pritchard, "and perhaps a trifle particular. Her ladyship likes the Worcester for coffee. Each cup has its, if I may, its place on the tray. It is not taste but habit. We observe our own foolishness," he added, not quite smiling. "Mr. Freddy, her ladyship's brother, will not take the one with the forget-me-nots. He says the flowers are importunate. Sir Felix has the hunting scenes. The plain white is always put at the far right of the tray and is for any guest who is particular. Last night, Dr. Mordaunt had that cup." "And last night," Alleyn said. Pritchard lifted a cup delicately between his fingers. "The plain was where I would not have put it. It was placed at the left, sir, next to the apostle spoons, and the one with the forget-me-nots that should have been left of centre had been shifted to the right." "Before or after service?" "Before, sir. When I came in for the coffee, the tray was as I had left it. When I returned from the sideboard with the pot, I noticed the change. It is my business to notice. One does not always comment." "Who had been in the room?" Pritchard considered. Mrs. Dacres was nearest the tray. She had been making herself agreeable to Lord Felix and to the little Lanyon girl, and her hand was, lightly only, upon the rim of the tray. She said something about sparing my old back and helping it along into the green salon. She spoke very nicely. It is not usual for guests to volunteer, but last night was not usual. "You allowed her to carry it?" Fox put in, tranquil as an aunt. "I would not allow a lady to carry a tray," said Pritchard stiffly. "She put her hand under it for a moment, only that. I took it in, but the arrangement had changed. Her ladyship did not alter it herself." "No, sir. Her ladyship never interferes with the lay of a tray. She has her ways. I have mine." Alleyn's glance ran upward to the row of cups. There was an almost absurd consolation in their ordered faces, the painted forget-me-nots and rampant horses and one austere white. He said, "And afterwards?" The plain white was brought back from the green salon with Dr. Mordaunt's saucer. I placed the cup on the dresser, as I do, and counted the spoons. One was missing. "An apostle?" "Yes, sir. St. John. He has a chalice with a serpent in it. It's a foolishness of mine to count them by their burdens. I noticed at once." "Where did you find it?" "In the scullery bucket. That was the girl's mistake. Ivy never put silver in the bucket. I would take it as a slight if I believed it to be a choice. She was distraught. I do not blame her." Fox, who had a gift for apparent obtuseness, said, "What would be the routine, Mr. Pritchard, if no one altered anything and no one was distraught?" The routine, Inspector Fox, is this. The cups are set. The napkins are folded in what Mrs. Bligh calls the bishop's mitre. The spoons lie on the napkins, bowls inward, saints to the wall. The tray goes in on my arm. Her ladyship takes the first cup, Sir Felix the second, and so on. If any person is particular, I say nothing but one notices. One steers the plain white to them. One observes who does not take sugar. Dr. Mordaunt did not. I hand the sugar tongs to the next. We are not simple, but the method is simple. And last night the method failed. Pritchard lifted his chin. Last night there was kindness, sir. The sort of impetuous kindness one has learned to steer past, if it will steer. Mrs. Dacres had a way with the tray. She asked the doctor if he would not be mother to the coffee. He said no, very softly. He had a way of speaking that one listened to. She laughed and said she would mother him instead. Her hand, just so, went to the cups. Mrs. Dacres has a perfume, Alleyn said, not quite asking. A violet water, sir. It is charming in a room. On silver it is less, it lingers. On St. John? Pritchard conceded it with a microscopic nod. There was a fragrance. There is no sin in that. No, Alleyn agreed. He took up the plain cup, turned it to bring an invisible crest to a proper facing, and set it down where Pritchard's eye had first placed it. You spoke last night of a bell, he said. For coffee. Her ladyship rings the little Chinese bell in the green salon when she is ready. It is not a pull. It is a hand bell. She does not ring it more than once. Last night it did not ring. Mr. Dacre, being theatrical, clapped his hands softly. It served. And yet you went in at the usual time. I did, sir. One senses the moment. It is part of the service. Alleyn said nothing for a space. The rain made a minuteness of sound on the glass. Fox breathed with discreet solidity. Pritchard returned the cup to its particular place, and in doing so restored something of himself. It was, Alleyn thought, as significant as any mark on a piece of metal that the man should have noticed a cup's position, a faint perfume on a spoon, in the absence of a single bell in a house where bells were rung or not rung according to an unwritten and inviolable liturgy. It is in such things, he reminded himself, that passions carve their alphabet. He thanked Pritchard, who received thanks as if they were an oblique comment on the polish of his silver, and, with Fox behind him, returned to the corridor. The muffled house took their reflections into itself. In the green salon the portrait gazed, steady and unamused, over a coffee service that was once more merely domestic. The silence pressed as it had done last night, but, like any habit, it could be broken. The house had contrived a hush that was not quite piety and not quite fatigue. It was the sort that follows an illness in a nursery. Voices at half-mast, doors persuaded rather than closed, a sense that in the very air some frail equilibrium must not be disturbed. Alleyn, who had learned to take such atmospheres as one takes weather, sat with Fox in the small morning room where the sun, withheld by a London pall, put merely its signature on the window panes. Reeves, correct in black, entered with a salver. A note, sir, brought by hand. The lad would not give a name. Alleyn glanced without apparent interest towards the corridor where the household's pulse beat soft and irregular. For me? For the doctor, sir. Dr. Hallam. He is with her ladyship. Thank you, Reeves. If you will be so good as to leave it with us, I will see that Dr. Hallam has it. The butler's eyebrows, which could express more scruple than many people's voices, made the unvoiced protest and subsided. He withdrew with that noiseless authority which good butlers acquire by practice rather than desire. Alleyn turned the envelope over in his hand. The paper was the good cream that might stand in Lady Rathbone's blotter, but the monogram, a discreet wreath about an R, was impressed a trifle faintly, as if the die had not quite consented. He did not open it, though Fox's attention, an honest dog's at a closed cupboard, was upon him. "We'll take it to the doctor," he said. They found Hallam standing at the window of the blue drawing-room, his head inclined in the posture of one who has listened so much to pain that his neck has grown to it. Lady Rathbone sat very straight on a small chair, her hands on the lap of her dark dress, an arrangement of grief both stately and efficient. "A note has come for you," Alleyn said, and gave it into Hallam's hand. It was curious what little things can happen without sound. Hallam drew in his breath. The envelope cracked faintly. A sheet of paper whispered, and yet it seemed to Alleyn that the room made less noise than it had before. Hallam read quickly, and then again, his lip moving as if to shape words for an audience long gone. Colour withdrew from his face, and then, with a conscientious effort, returned. "It was from Miss Darrow," he said. "She asks me to forgive the abruptness of last night and begs me, oh, for God's sake, she begs me to prescribe silence." "It is—" "Yes." Alleyn put out his hand. "May I?" He did not read so much as allow the impression to sink through his eyes. The hand was Miss Darrow's, or an excellent imitation of it, large, flowing, the high loop on the L that actors like, the dashing cross on the T that makes more promise than fulfillment. And yet there was a slight drag on the downstrokes, a hesitation in the airs that he remembered she had not had when he had seen her write a note to the chauffeur yesterday for a misplaced rug. The fold was wrong for Lady Rathbone's stationery, which Reeves invariably folded in thirds for her ladyship's letters. This was folded once and then again, awkwardly. The faintest exhalation of orris rose from the paper, not unlike the dressing-table scent in Miss Darrow's room, but a shade heavier. And in the margin, where a left-hander will sometimes smudge and a right-hander ink the edge of the palm, there was a small half-moon of graphite, as if the writer had written first in pencil. "It came by hand," Alleyn said, without looking up. "Reeves says the boy would not give a name." "Why should she write to him?" Lady Rathbone asked, in that calm which for some women is duty and defence. "If she wrote, poor child, why should she use my paper? And why today?" "Because it is today," said Hallam, and the words were so simple that they might have been very wise or very foolish. He put a hand to the mantelpiece, and Fox, anxious for him in the large, unworded way that was Fox's, took half a step. "Sit down, Doctor," Alleyn said, and after a tiny, rebellious pause, the doctor obeyed. The door opened a bare inch and closed again. There was a rustle in the passage, the timorous flourish that betrays a maid with news. Reeves, returned by sanction of his office, bent to Lady Rathbone. "Miss Clare is not in her room, my lady." "Not in—" She asked to be excused after Mr. Fox had finished with her. She said she wished to take the air. She has not come back. The garden door stands unlatched. Alleyn rose. It was not alarm so much as an acceptance that the pattern had added a line. He looked down at the note once more and gave it back to Hallam. "Would you be so kind as to keep that for me, folded as it is?" He smiled, and the smile made no promise. "Fox, perhaps we'll stretch our legs." They stepped out into the meagre garden where London, peering over walls, had its own clipped shrubs and patches of considerate soil. A cat crossed the path with ceremony. The unlatched door made its own suggestion. Beyond, in a side shelter that Lady Rathbone called her Italian corner, a figure sat with her head against the ivy and her hands open on her lap, palms up, as if she had expected rain. Miss Clare's eyes opened at the sound of their approach. She was not faint exactly, nor ill. She had simply retired from the dialogue without announcing her exit. Her lips made an effort at a smile that could not commit itself. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I thought if I sat very still I might not hear anything at all." Alleyn looked at her hands, at the pale crescents on her fingers where rings had been taken off for rehearsal, at the smear of graphite on her thumb. He said very gently, "We can bear it together for a little while if you like. Then perhaps you will tell me where you went after the music stopped." Her eyes flickered. He did not press. Not yet. In the house, a bell struck the hour, muffled as if by habit or intention. The note in Hallam's pocket and the unlocked door in the garden said as much as any voice, if one had the manners to listen. Fox shifted his weight on the gravel, and the small sound, in that doctored silence, was enough to begin the next movement. Alleyn stood in the little theatre and watched the motes drift through a blade of afternoon sun. They ascended and fell with the shallow draught that slipped under the stage door, as if the air itself practiced a decorum of breath. Behind him, the house was very nearly silent. Dame Beatrice had taken her grievance upstairs under a veil of shawl and hauteur. Sir Hugo had retreated to telephones and the quietus of committee calls. Dr. Quain's absence, requested and polite, was being managed by Mr. Packer as if it were a matter of program notes and not the headlong vanishing of a black prescription book. Even the piano had closed its mouth. He turned his head a fraction and looked towards the wing where the chaise had stood when Eleanor Gray was discovered. Someone, Chivers no doubt, had returned it to its proper angle, facing the prompt side in the house, as if it were a conscientious member of the cast. In that, as in so much here, ritual had restored itself when sensation failed. He had examined, touched, smelt, and noted. He had asked quite ordinary questions in quite ordinary tones. He had been bored by Edward Sarbury and amused by him. He had watched Viola Turnell swallow at a glass of water she did not sip, and had registered the small, obstinate pride with which she did not mention her faintness in the morning-room. He had listened to Dame Beatrice's voice slide from oratorio to comedy and back again. He had felt the hard, bright gaze of Quain and observed, more than once, that his hands, when at rest, curled slightly as if they expected always to hold something delicate and necessary. The forged note, found tucked against the French melody in Eleanor's score, lay now among his papers. It told the girl, sweetly, with a professional concision, to take a double dose of the silenced draught. It contained no signature but a confident hand. Packer had said, "Like a gentleman writing a check, Inspector," and had then, with a secretary's loyalty, complimented the clarity of Dr. Quain's script. Packer's own pointed italic could not have produced those rounded capitals. Neither could Sir Hugo's long slant. Dame Beatrice's hand, when she scrawled a dedication, cut across the page like a sword. Viola wrote like a schoolgirl who had not yet decided whether to commit to an adult, flourished R. Harbury's notes, crumpled and vehement, were a mess of exclamation. There remained, as he turned each page in his mind, the sense that the hand was someone's disguise of their own. Not a man making himself another man, but a person who had spent a life adjusting italics to masters and mistresses. He had not said this aloud. He had not said aloud that Mrs. Fanshawe, the housekeeper, deployed silences as a soldier deploys cover. Nor that Chivers, who tied the curtain cords in reef knots too neat to be amateur, had stared at the dressing-room bell-pull with an expression briefly, only briefly, discomposed. The tassel's fringe had been twisted in the novice's way. Nor yet that Eleanor's little row of pencil marks above high notes in the French song were darker today than yesterday, and of a harder lead. Nor that the faint medicinal sweetness which hung about the chaise had been briefly present, in lighter degree, on the lip of Viola's glass, before Packer whisked it away, as if housekeeping lay within his province. He thought of Quain's doctrine of therapeutic silence, delivered the previous evening to an audience that had prided itself on understanding beautiful things. Silence, the doctor had said, with an ascetic smile meant for the applause, is sometimes the only tolerable remedy. It had been meant to be clever, and if one looked at Dame Beatrice, a trifle provocative. It had also been true in a way that made one's neck feel cold when standing in a sunbeam. Who had an interest in Eleanor's silence? Not the girl herself, whose voice promised the sort of career that makes a coach of a singer and a service of a theatre. Not Harbury, who saw in her a swifter rehearsal and a better opening. Not Dame Beatrice, whose magnanimity to ingenue was genuine when her throne was secure. Sir Hugo's security was in his name and his house. Scandal would be the greater expense. Mrs. Fanchot's dominion ended at the green baize door. Chivers's pride was in a correct cue. Packer, the adaptable Packer, fed on everyone's necessities. Alleyn knew, without for a moment permitting his face to show knowledge, that the forged note had been composed with a mind that already knew the routine. When the girl would be alone, where the score would lie, when the draft could be added, and how much would be too much for a small person who had that morning not eaten. He thought again of the missing book, of Quain's pinched look when he heard, and of the over-careful tone with which he agreed to remain within call. If it had been stolen to incriminate him, the thief had taste for melodrama. If it had been taken to prevent the discovery of an altered prescription, the thief had already practiced in this very room the unmusical art of substitution. Nothing in this was yet proof. He liked it because it settled, like the motes, into its place in the light. He would not presently argue it. He would ask, instead, for a cup of tea where nobody expected it. He would send a constable, not Brer Fox, but a very dull one, to stand in the passage and hear who did not wish to pass him. He would, before dinner, ask Chivers to show him how the bell-pull ought to hang. He would say to Viola nothing at all and see what she chose to answer. For when a house prescribes its silence, the first sound is the person who breaks it by habit. It is habit, Alleyn told himself, that unties a knot. He took the forged note from his pocket and slipped it back. The stage doors sighed. He stood where Eleanor had so nearly slept and looked out at the empty, velveted house. He could almost, if he were sentimental, have bowed. Instead, he turned and walked quietly towards the green baize door. Lady Honoria's drawing-room, with its grey silk walls and its cold flowers, had the air of a place composed for a deliberate pause. They had drifted back there after the long, hushed afternoon, each to a small island of upholstery, as if a rearrangement of chairs might imply a rearrangement of events. Outside, the river accepted the first lamps with a weary docility. Jessup had brought in tea. Nobody drank it. Alleyn stood by the fireplace, not quite warming his hands. Fox, reliable and unobtrusive, had taken up a position near the door with the look of a man who had removed his boots before treading on parquet. The faces spread before Alleyn were like the cast of a play after the curtain had fallen, too careful and a little blank. Dame Portia's rings flashed as she touched the bridge of her nose. Professor Martin had the expression of a scholar suspecting an error in his own footnotes. General Branscombe sat bolt upright, as if his back were an instruction to the rest of him. Miranda Lewis, pale and transient, watched the carpet. Julian Harrow, with paint under a thumbnail like a guilty thought, drummed one finger upon his trouser seam. Miss Finch clasped her narrow hands on her knee, and Jessup stood at a respectful attention that nevertheless observed everything it needed to. Alleyn said, "I must ask you all to remain at Lady Honoria's convenience for a little longer. I shall not detain you in a body. There are one or two matters best discussed privately." The room received this without protest. Only Dame Portia let out a small breath one might have mistaken for a sigh of stage business. Alleyn's glance rested upon Miss Finch. "Miss Finch, if you please." She rose at once. The movement was exact, as everything about her seemed to be the adjustment of the spectacles, the straightening of the cuff, a life organized against disturbance. Alleyn opened the door for her and, with a nod to Fox, led the way across the small landing to Lady Honoria's writing-room. It looked out upon the water. The light caught upon the glass and returned itself in a mild echo. He shut the door. Miss Finch stood near the escritoire, a precise little figure against the pale wood. Alleyn did not immediately sit. He let silence do its work, feeling, once again, its double edge as comfort and pressure. When he spoke, it was in the tone he reserved for the confessionals of distressed people, neither coaxing nor judicial. "Miss Finch," he said, "do you recall what you did with Dr. Carstone's laryngeal spray after luncheon?" She was prepared for the question then. He saw the slight, prepared tightening at the corners of the mouth. "I wiped it, as I always do with his muslin," she said. "I replaced it in its case and set it where he would not forget it." "On the little table to the left of the piano?" "Yes." "Aligned," said Alleyn, so that the label squared itself to the table's edge. The spectacles glinted. "I dislike disorder, Inspector." "Of course. You expressed the same preference this morning. In Dr. Carstone's consulting room, the shelves are kept in an almost military arrangement. Fox observed as much, and envied you, I dare say. You use the same care here. It is a curious thing, however. When I saw the spray after what happened in the music room, I found that the cap had been screwed down harder than Dr. Carstone would ever suffer. He used to leave it easy, I'm told, to save his fingers." She said nothing. The river sculled against the quay, as if someone were turning the page of a large, damp book. "I make no accusation," Alleyn went on quietly, "but there has been a small comedy of letters. One of them bore my name in a hand imitating my clerk's. It asked that you might return to the surgery at once to look for a missing prescription pad. You did not go. You showed it first to Jessup, who, having listened to its spelling, formed a view of it and of you that he conveyed to me with exemplary caution. I should be grateful if you would tell me why you did not go." Her face altered very little, but something in it settled, a resignation perhaps, or merely the acceptance that a conversation long avoided had arrived and would not be improved by tardiness. "Because I knew it to be false," she said. "No pad was missing. I had placed it myself in the second drawer left." "And the timetable for the afternoon?" "Unchanged." "Except," said Alleyn, "for a brief excursion into the music room which is not in the plan you showed Fox." She glanced away towards the river. "I tidied, Inspector. The metronome had been left running. The lid of the piano was a finger mark. It is a habit of mine to put such things right. If it was not in the plan, it was because such trifles are not plans. They merely impede them." "Very true," said Alleyn. He moved to a chair and sat. "Miss Finch, we must speak plainly, though not unkindly. Dr. Carstone had enemies? No, that will not do. He had, let us say, those to whom his discretion was valued. He also had a certain appetite for power. To prescribe silence is to command a particular kind of obedience. You knew that. You lived with it." Her hand strayed briefly to the bone-thin throat. "He was an eminent man." "Yes." "And difficult." "Yes." "And sometimes," she said with a sudden soft bitterness that vanished as soon as expressed, "very careless." Alleyn waited. The room held itself like a breath. "I had hoped," she said at last, very quietly, "that it might be thought his heart." "You hoped for the mercy of error." He rose. "I cannot offer it, but I can offer order. There will be no scenes, Miss Finch. We shall not have them. Presently I shall ask you to come with me into Lady Honoria's drawing room. I shall speak to them. I shall speak gently. You may say as much or as little as you choose. Do you understand?" She nodded. "Yes, Inspector." "Thank you." He opened the door. For an instant she did not move. Then, with the exactitude of habit, she stepped past him and went out. Fox, in the passage, looked up and away again, like a discreet footman. Alleyn watched the river a moment longer. The lamp's reflections quivered and came to rest. He thought, "It is the neatness that tells, and the pity comes after." Then, with that economy which is close to kindness, he returned to the room where the others waited for the softest possible blow. They were all in the small saloon that looked across the square to a scrim of plane trees. Frost pressed a faint bloom upon the panes and made a veil of the lamps beyond. The remaining guests had withdrawn. The house had come at last to that curious hush which falls when servants move softly and doors obey some tacit pact. Alleyn sat with one knee crossed, his long hands folded upon it, as if he had come for music and found instead a different recital. Lady Honoria had placed herself a little apart, as if she were tolerably certain that her drawing-room was to be remembered for other reasons than its arrangement. The girl, pale and steady now, watched the fire and did not speak. Sebastian Lorne made a barricade of his shoulders and tried for nonchalance. Sir Adrian considered his cuff with elaborate detachment. Miss Grey folded and unfolded her gloves, drawing them through her fingers as one counts a rosary. Kersey, summoned for decency and because Alleyn had insisted that he be present, stood just inside the door and looked like a grave post. "Thank you," Alleyn said when they had settled into the species of quiet that attends a physician delivering a prognosis. "One always hopes at this point to be short. It is only fair to say that I shall not be." No one answered. It gave him more room to go on. Miss Ashe died, as the doctor suggested, in silence. That has a certain dreadful neatness to it, given the advice she had been following and the little tablets she took so dutifully. The laboratory has told me something about those pastilles. They were not only glycerin and menthol. They contained aconitine in a quantity small enough to be mistaken at first for mischance. It is a queer poison for a throat, but neat in its way, being most conveniently fatal without commotion. He observed the smallest flicker at the edge of vision and did not look to see whose it was. You will remember the odd little concordance of things that seemed like nothing. The prescription leaf torn from a pad, left on the table, and then not left. The metronome, set without reason to a pace Miss Ashe disliked. The cup with the faint hairline crack, which our victim never would use and yet was used tonight. And the note that sent Miss Grey out of the room just long enough in that unlucky quarter of an hour. Sir Adrian said, "My dear Inspector," very faintly, but Alleyn had no need to answer him. "Kersey," Alleyn said, "you keep an account of a household's rituals, do you not?" "I do my best, sir," Kersey said stolidly. "You observed, quietly, that Miss Ashe would not touch that cracked cup." "Yes, sir." "And you told me that Dr. Grieve," he said the name without weight, had on a previous visit remarked upon Miss Ashe's superstitious nonsense, and moved the cup from its end of the tray to the center, on the laughable theory that she would forget herself. He is a tidy man, and tidy men move what offends them into symmetry. One remembers oddly such things. Lady Honoria stirred. Must we? "We must," Alleyn said gently. "We have been careful, and we shall continue to be so." He turned his head a fraction, and in the act encompassed all of them. It would have been simple enough to add the tincture to the honey, but it was not done so. The taste would have betrayed it. It was added to the pastille. That requires a pipette and a certain patience. It also requires access, and access we can allot. The case was moved from the dressing table, where Miss Ashe kept it always, to her bag. That was clever, because it meant she would not see in the familiar light of her dressing room that the lozenges no longer gleamed quite as they should. The person who moved them knew her routine, knew her obedience to her doctor, and profited by both. Miss Grey's gloves ceased their migration. Sebastian made a sound as if to speak, and then remembered himself. The forged note to Miss Grey was excellent, Alleyn said, almost as if he admired it. 5 measured lines and a signature that nobody would trouble to doubt. A rehearsal call, earlier than expected, in Sir Adrian's own hand. "Sir Adrian, you do write with a peculiarly characteristic slope. Someone had copied it before, on a prescription leaf, as it happens, one of those detached leaves we spoke of. The watermark told the tale. You, Doctor, carry those pads. That is what they are for. Dr. Grave looked at the fire. He was a very composed man. He had contrived an entire vocation out of composing other people's voices. This is monstrous, he said, which Alleyn thought was the most appropriate word and the least helpful. You advised her to silence, Alleyn said. You arranged that she should be unable to protest, out of obedience, not incapacity, while you doctored her throat and, at last, her lozenges. You wished, do let me be exact, to stop her from speaking not only on the stage. She was going to speak at the inquiry, and it would have gone ill with you. There is no need to rehearse here the complaints of your other patient. She wrote to Miss Ashe. Miss Ashe decided, in a most untheatrical way, to support her. You, Doctor, could not bear the loss. Not so much of reputation, perhaps, as of that peculiar influence you prize. Greaves' hands, which had been so calm, opened upon his knees like flowers in a time-lapse. You embroider, Inspector, he said. You make a pattern out of trifles. I do, Alleyn agreed. But trifles are what we have. And there is this. The metronome. You take a metronome to your sessions, you time breath. It is your habit to set it to 88. Miss Ashe always set Lady Honoria's metronome to 72. Tonight it was at 88. The little click was in my head all the evening. It was quite maddening. The doctor's eyes at last came round. They were not unkindly eyes. Yes, he said in a voice that did not quite reach the room, it is maddening. No one spoke. In the fire, a coal shifted with a sedate sigh. Alleyn, who had no appetite for triumph, waited for the silence to be complete. Then, because he was, after all, a policeman and not a priest, he said, "If you please, Doctor." He did not add what was to please him. That would come, inevitably, after. The quiet that followed had the texture of velvet, heavy, swallowingly soft, and faintly oppressive. Lady Honoria stood with one hand on the back of a chair. She had not sat since Alleyn had spoken. Her pearls, shifted by the movement of her breath, ticked faintly against one another. Inspector Fox, on a signal from Alleyn, stepped back rather than forward. The others found their places by instinct, as if a long rehearsal were coming to its end. Julian Carteret, by the fire, with his hands crooked deep in his pockets. Cressida on the fringe of the carpet, her gloves crushed in a small, desperate packet. Dr. Quarles, with his eyes fixed for once on the hollows between his fingers. Mr. Pym near the door, precise and unblinking, as much a part of the furniture as the ormolu clock. I suppose, Lady Honoria said, you must say it in a particular way. I'm afraid I must, Alleyn answered. Lady Honoria Vale, I'm charging you with the murder of Sir Felix Damerel. Anything you say may be taken down and used in evidence. One heard the words settle in the room, like the fall of flower dust. She made a small inclination, as if this too were a form. Mr. Pym, she said, and her voice was perfectly composed, will you bring tea? No one looked at Alleyn to see if he would forbid it. He did not. Pym bowed and went away with the upright stillness of a man for whom service is a creed. Fox glanced at Alleyn. Alleyn's head moved almost imperceptibly. The outer door closed in the distance, and the muted clink of porcelain sounded somewhere like a reply from another house. Cressida took a step towards Lady Honoria. "Godmother," she began, and stopped. It was not fear that silenced her. Lady Honoria had turned with such exquisite uninterest towards the sofa that Cressida's words could find no purchase. "You have been clever," Lady Honoria said to Alleyn. "It is usually a vulgar cleverness with your people. You have spared me that." "I hope so," Alleyn said. "It is not always possible." "The thing will be unsightly," Lady Honoria went on, half to herself, half to the room. "There will be a scrum of small men with pencils. You will allow me to write to Sir Lionel, my solicitor. He will know what to do about the trust." "You shall write," Alleyn said. "Inspector Fox will remain with you." "Of course," She seemed faintly reminded of domestic politeness. "Captain Riven, do you suppose you might take Cressida home? She needn't, no. There will be calls and repetitions. She must be looked after." She almost smiled. He prescribed silence for her, didn't he? It seems, after all, he knew what was best. The cruelty of it arrived without emphasis and hung between them. Cressida's face altered, then steadied. "I will not be looked after," she said quietly, and turned her head to Alleyn. "Will I be sent for?" "In due time, Miss Booth," he said. Pym returned with a tray, tea, thin sandwiches, a plate of almond biscuits. He set it down where Lady Honoria's hand indicated, poured, and stood back. She took the cup without tremor and did not drink. "Pym," she said, "you will have the green valise brought down, the one with the leather strap. Put in, please, the grey and my dark hat." She looked at Alleyn. "Unless you have some regulation that requires me to go in my dinner dress." "I should prefer that you did not change without an officer present," Alleyn said. "You may take a wrap." "Very well, lavender," she added to Pym. "The cashmere." He bowed and withdrew again, his eyes, as he passed, meeting Alleyn's with the briefest acknowledgement. Alleyn had the sense of a message offered and accepted without words, that Pym had known or guessed, and that his compact with honor had been maintained until honor itself changed shape. Fox drew up a small writing table. Lady Honoria sat and wrote 2 notes with her habitual angular economy. One for the solicitor and one addressed in her clear hand to the Committee of the Voice Fund. When she had finished, she folded them and, with a neat flick, sealed them with a small blob of varnish from a bottle Pym provided, as if she were a woman out of a different century dispatching orders to tenants. "Inspector," she said without looking up, "I remember. One says nothing." "Yes," Alleyn said. "And if one must say something, one says it with care. That was always my advice." She allowed herself a fractional glance in Cressida's direction. "It's the only decent way in a room." When the car came round, Fox had arranged for it to stop not at the front, where reporters were already milling under the lamps, but by the Mews gate and the strip of garden where the laurel made a black tunnel. Lady Honoria rose, took up the cashmere, and paused with one hand on the mantle's cool marble. "Sir Felix," she said, almost conversationally, as if recalling a social engagement, was not a man to alter his advice. "Do you know, Mr. Alleyn, I believe that was what I could not bear." "I think I do know," Alleyn said. They went out together. The night smelled faintly of rain and carbolic. Somewhere a taxi door slammed. From the upstairs landing, the portrait of Sir Geoffrey Vale looked down, its painted complacency unruffled. Pym held the Mews door. Lady Honoria passed him, and as she did so, she touched his sleeve, a gesture so slight that Cressida, watching from the hall, might have imagined it. "At the car," Fox said. "Will you sit beside me, madam?" "Wherever you like," she replied, and stepped in without haste. Alleyn closed the door. He looked back once at the house, at the slit of light the door left before Pym, with his customary exactitude, drew it to. The light thinned, trembled, and went out. They met in the morning room, where the river put down its pale reflection and made of the window a sheet of light. The inspector had asked for privacy. The house, exhausted by whispers, had sunk into that particular quiet of grand rooms after guests have gone and servants are noiseless by training. Miss Lyle stood by the escritoire with its regimented stationery. Her hands, which had always been dutiful and exact, rested on the edge as if the grain would steady them. She had dressed with more care than was necessary at that hour. The beige of her frock persisted even in the light, an anodyne shade that wished not to be remembered. "You asked for me, Inspector," she said, without emphasis. "Thank you," he replied. "There are a few small matters. I shall be as brief as the circumstances will allow." She inclined her head. The trill of a distant tea cart reached them but did not enter. He moved not towards her but towards the writing table, touched with a finger the portable typewriter she preferred to the larger machine in the library. This one misaligns its ease. You said it irritates you and you avoid it for invitations, yet the appointment note sent to Miss Graychard employed an E of this persuasion. The note which asked her to come to the blue drawing-room for a quiet word at 9:30. Her composure did not falter, though he saw the minor tightening at the jaw, not of obstinacy, but of decision. You attribute it to me. He did not smile. It is one attribute. There are others. Mr. Baines, who is very loyal to the proprieties of this house, struggled last night with his own. He held back that he saw you cross from the study to the blue room at 9:20. He told me this morning. He has not betrayed you. He has finally obeyed his office. Discretion is a hard master. A breath left her, almost impatiently. He would have seen many persons crossing rooms. There were guests. Not at that particular minute. Lady Honoria was in the music room, vainly engaged in distracting the general from speaking of the Desert War. The doctor had gone out to telephone from the hall, the only place, he says, where he can be sure of getting a line to Harley Street. Our painter was sulking in the conservatory. You were alone. You had the little silver tin of pastilles, Miss Lyle. Not the doctor's tin. His is scratched across the lid at the corner and smelt faintly of eucalyptus. The one you handled last night smelt of glycerin and something more bitter. Digitalis, I think. Not ground, but expressed. She shifted her hands. It was in the house. The general keeps it. The general keeps tablets, he said. He counts them from habit, as soldiers count men. He would have noticed if you had touched his box. He did not. But Lady Honoria's gardener uses foxglove leaves in his more eccentric remedies for blight, and the housekeeper keeps glycerine for coughs. He paused. You have an exact nature, Miss Lyle. You understand proportions. She turned from the escritoire and looked past him to the river. She would have destroyed all of them, she said, with a sentence and at her leisure. She had no intention whatsoever of allowing him to keep his work, to keep his reputation, to keep even his marriage, thin and brittle as it is. Him being the man you serve. She laughed lightly. Serve. It is an old word, it will do. You might have told me, he said, about the threat, about the letter in which she named her price. She named a performance, Miss Lyle replied, a private performance of power, to be repeated whenever her spirits flagged. The doctor's prescription was silence. I thought it apt. I confess the irony tempted me. And the routine of the house made it possible, he said. She always paused in the blue room to collect herself before leaving. She preferred to be alone a moment. She said it steadied her for the adoration in the hall. She took one lozenge when nerves set in. You knew that. You removed the top layer and painted the topmost suite with your tincture. When she obeyed the doctor's prescription, she obeyed yours. Miss Lyle looked at him directly. No one need know, she said softly. There has been so much talk these 2 days. I could go away. To an aunt in Torquay. It is not melodrama, Inspector. I'm not playing a tragedy. I'm asking for a kindness large enough to be impossible. He considered her, and the light on the river and the sound of Lady Honoria somewhere insisting that luncheon be simple, and the memory of the actress lying as if sleep had come to heel at the foot of her chair. He was a man past certain illusions. He had the law and his own conscience, and a dislike of tidy conclusions. Miss Lyle, he said, you have done a thing that cannot be folded and put away. It is, if you will, the only thing in this house not susceptible to good housekeeping. He moved to the bell and did not ring it. But we shall be quiet. There will be no scene. Mr. Baines will bring your hat and gloves. We shall go out by the garden door. Her face altered, as if a mask had set. I made it clean, she said almost to herself. I made it clean. He shook his head very slightly. No, you made it invisible. They walked out through the green corridor of the conservatory, where the painter had left a rag stiff with turpentine and the ghost of last night's flowers hung in the air. In the gravel sweep, a few leaves had fallen in exact twos. The day had the mildness of late autumn, a season that behaves and then declines. When at last he returned alone to the blue drawing-room, he stood before the chair that had been made ready with cushions and the little table with the silver tin, emptied now, open to prove its innocence or guilt. He set the lid back with care as one does with relics not one's own. The house stirred to its day. He thought of the doctor, who had put his faith in silence, and of how silence had been taken up and sharpened into a tool. He drew the curtains an inch wider. The river took the light and did not argue.